No, no, no.
Okay.
Man, navigating, what is it called? Just wait. Back to school after COVID-19, navigating social emotional. Someone in Hong Kong, which is funny because they're possibly, did I tell you that they're locked?
I'm going to get us started. Let me say good morning to all of you in Asia and good evening from some of us who are still here in the US. It's a pleasure to welcome you to this evening's or to this morning's presentation led by Chris Joffe and his colleagues from Joffe Emergency Services. I think the topic has attracted a great deal of interest for obvious reasons. And we are looking forward to spending the next 60 to 90 minutes, 60 minutes plus questions and answers with Chris and company, who will share their insights on this very, very important topic. IRCOS welcomes all of you. Thanks you for your continued engagement with our webinar series. And we hope that in the not too distant future, we will see each other all together in person. But thank you again for joining us, and I look forward to learning with you. Chris and Sarah, you guys want to introduce yourselves, and we'll go from there. And you have your screen still shared?
We'll go ahead and get it shared now.
Okay.
Thank you, Ed. Thank you to all for joining us for this conversation. We are particularly excited about this conversation. I'll sort of give you a little bit of history of our organization, and then I really want to spend a moment just reflecting on where we are right now in this moment. But first, our organization was founded to support schools in health, safety, and security. And so we've been supporting schools since 2007 to build resilience, to build strength, and to build capacity for emergencies to occur on campus. Of course, as we all know, about 2 years ago, that meant that we became COVID folks. But we are grateful and excited and really, really ready to begin to support schools on other issues again, too. When we put this talk together, our focus was really rooted in the fact that in every conversation,
it has positive impacts on job satisfaction, positive impacts on teaching.
Joining us, I want to just ask you to hit the mute button just so we don't hear any background noise from you. No worries at all, but if you could just make sure that you're muted, and then as we get to Q&A, of course, we'll invite you to unmute and share out any questions that you have. But as I said, we put this talk together because in the moment that Ed reached out and said, we want to start this conversation, it felt like every conversation we were having with a school leader was a conversation that went something like this. I've been a teacher or a principal or a school leader or an administrator in my school for over X years. Often it was 10 or 15 or 20. And I've never had as many conflicts on my campus as I have had this school year. And when I share with you that it felt like it was every conversation, it's not hyperbole. We were having that conversation with school after school after school. And the conflicts were between, in some cases, parents and parents, or teachers and teachers, or in some cases, parents and teachers, or worse, I think, parents and other students. And so we started this dialogue as a team and as a larger community of schools around how we could affect that. What the specific actions were that we could take in that moment to start to correct for that and to get back to some sense of on-campus harmony. And so we blamed a lot of that on sort of deterioration of mental health that occurred while we were all operating in our own isolated homes and spaces, and while we had not come together, not had a chance to practice being in a room with one another. And I think we were largely right. I think, you know, it was really hard for those of us that returned to school earlier this school year, for some that returned last school year, depending on where you are in your return. Some, I realize, have not returned yet. But depending on where you are in your return process, I think, you know, the takeaway that I've heard from so many schools has been it's significantly harder than we anticipated. Not so much the safety practices, but the human practices of getting back together in a common space. And then this week, conflict began in yet another part of our world. And yet again, we found ourselves thrust into an environment rich with conflict for students and families and staff and faculty that either have direct links to Russia and or Ukraine, and or that are simply seeing yet another bout of uncertainty happen in the world around us. And so I think there are folks on all sides of this that are affected deeply and will continue to be affected deeply over the course of the next days and weeks and months. And the truth is, there's not a one size fits all. There's not a perfect solution that we can offer tonight or tomorrow or this morning. I'm figuring out my time zones here. But we hope that we can share with you some solutions that we've seen have success across our schools. And we hope that we can empower you to build relationships with students, to rebuild relationships with staff, with faculty, and with parents, and to find mechanisms to reinstill a sense of connection, community, and belonging on your campuses. And we hope that we can give you some tools that you can actually take away and implement on Monday. So that's really what we're going to try to do today. Most of today's conversation is going to be led by Sarah Mathew, who I'll introduce and ask to introduce herself in just a moment. And then by Kerry Wrenick, who again, I think Sarah will probably ask Kerry to introduce herself, and then Sarah will take the floor again here in just a moment. But as we go, they're going to be leading this conversation from both the physical and mental health perspective, as well as from the educator's perspective. And I'm going to pipe in because my background is really in the safety and security space. And so I'm going to pipe in with some COVID thoughts and some conflict thoughts and some on-campus security thoughts, but really let the two of them lead this dialogue because they have lived this and led this for their careers. And so I'm really excited to introduce Sarah Mathew, who is our Director of School Health Services, National Director actually now of School Health Services, and who will lead the first part of our conversation this morning. It is afternoon, I'm in California. It's afternoon for me, and the coffee clearly hasn't set in yet.
Thank you, Chris. I'm probably not good with the time either, so I'm just going to say good day. My name is Sarah Mathew, and I am a lifelong learner and teacher. I'm an early childhood educator. I have my career has been at the nexus of school health and education for 20 some years. I won't acknowledge how many 20s. But obviously the last 10 to 15 years of my career has been very much focused on mental wellness and on social emotional learning. So I'm really thrilled to be here today to give you a very, very high level introduction to social emotional learning and to get you to some really good resources for that. I am going to let my co-presenter, Kerry, introduce herself, and she's going to start us off on our presentation, and then I'm actually pulling up the rear, Chris. So Kerry, off to you.
Thank you, Sarah. Good morning, everyone. My name is Kerry Wrenick, and I am the Director of Consultative Services, which means I lead kind of the emergency management portion of Joffe. I come to you with a background as a licensed social worker working within the education system. So all things mental well-being is near and dear to my heart. So thank you for joining us this morning as we talk back to school after COVID-19, navigating social emotional learning. What we hope that you gain from our time together this morning are these three key objectives. What is social emotional learning and how can it add value within my school community? What are the fundamental principles of SEL? We're going to share resources from our partner at CASTLE, which is the Collaborative for Academic, Social, and Emotional Learning. And then we're going to present how can we support educators and school staff with implementation of SEL. And if you are a note taker, rest assured you don't have to be occupied with taking lots of notes. You're going to get a copy of this presentation, and then we created a one-pager for you to take away from today's conversation as a reference and further resources for you. So I have dropped that in the chat box. So what is SEL? Social emotional learning is an integral part of education and human development. SEL is a process through which all young people and adults acquire and apply the knowledge, skills, and attitudes to develop healthy identities, manage emotions, and achieve personal and collective goals, to feel and show empathy for others, and to establish and maintain supportive relationships, and to make responsible and caring decisions. SEL advances educational equity and excellence through authentic school, family, community partnerships to establish learning environments and experiences that feature trusting and collaborative relationships, rigorous and meaningful curriculum and instruction, and ongoing evaluation. SEL can help address various forms of inequity and empower young people and adults to co-create thriving schools and contribute to safe, healthy, and just communities. And if you didn't capture that very lengthy description, we have a short 3-minute video that we'd like to share with you that explains through the eyes of children what SEL is.
School should be where everyone feels comfortable and everyone should know that everyone's unique and you don't have to be perfect.
SEL is really about the holistic development of young people.
Social emotional learning to me provides students with purpose. SEL was a great foundation and catalyst for me. It taught me to value education and value human connection.
Social and emotional learning is the process by which children grow and develop their emotional lives and their relationships.
Well, social emotional learning gives a space where people can actually look at students as more than just numbers on a standardized test. We give people the space to explore who they are as people, to look at their identity, to recognize how important relationships are and what it means to be a successful human, not just a successful student.
In my classroom, they are able to share the things that are personal to them. They're able to celebrate one another's differences. They're inclusive of each other despite what race, socioeconomic, or gender they're from.
SEL promotes academic achievement in effective ways, raising test scores 11 percentile points. It reduces anxiety and distress as well. So it improves pro-social behavior and how kids get along and attend in the classroom.
SEL is rocket fuel. It is the thing that can actually accelerate the advancement of our society.
When I think about a healthy environment for my daughter, I'm looking at, are those teachers engaged? Are they showing her to be an empathetic person? When teachers are engaged and they have that engagement with the students are going to excel.
The educators, the families, the community members, and the students agree that this is important.
How do we make sure that kids don't just get a segment of their life where social and emotional learning is important, but they're getting that in all parts of their life?
Right now, we have an untapped pool of talent. And so the idea is to leverage SEL in order to help young people realize those talents and thereby help the broader society and in fact the world.
we really can create schools that inspire, that help students find their sense of self, that help students find their sense of purpose, to learn how to relate to one another, and to better prepare kids for wherever they choose to go in life.
Well, SEL taught you to step up when you need to, but also step back when you had to. So you were creating space for yourself, but also making space for others.
Now we open a new chapter, and the new chapter is inviting educators, families, young people, scholars, policymakers, inviting the whole country into the dialogue about the kind of social and emotional development we want to promote for all of our children in the future.
So let's take just about 30 seconds. And I want all of you as educators, as individuals who work directly with students and young people, think about a young person in your life. What do you hope that they will learn and be able to prepare for the world tomorrow? And in the chat, I just want you to type in a word or a few words that summarize what are your hopes for them, to set the context for this next part of the conversation. So just real quick, type in a few words, your hopes. Compassion, empathy. See empathy a lot. Curiosity. Oh, that's a good one. Yeah. Sounds like you guys have this SEL thing. So I don't think we need to proceed, but we will anyways. It sounds like you all have a really great foundation for where we're at. So let's separate fact from fiction. There's a lot of misconceptions about what SEL is. So we want to break it down for you, tell you what it is and what it is not. So SEL is shaped by local priorities. It's individualized and customized for every school, family, child, community. It is not a one-size-fits-all model. The purpose around SEL is to build relationships and skills that promote healthy well-being. It is not therapy. And SEL does boost academic performance and deepens engagement with content. It is not a distraction from the core academics. And then SEL helps students understand different perspectives and to share ideas. It is not a way to teach a specific political agenda. It's important to identify those areas. So let's talk about the benefits of SEL. There was a 2011 meta-analysis that rendered compelling findings around SEL programming and improvements in SEL skills. Some of these findings include improved attitudes about self, others, and school, positive classroom behavior. And as quoted in the video, there was an 11 percentile point gain on academics. This is significant and warrants emphasis. This kind of improvement on academics is frankly what has gotten everyone talking about SEL. This data point highlights that SEL is critically important and should be taken seriously. And let's not forget about the other data points in red, right? Reductions in conduct problems is an important finding. But remember, SEL is not a behavior management system. And reductions in emotional distress, again, that warrants significant emphasis. We're living in a time when emotional distress, depression, anxiety, suicide are all at an all-time high. So understanding that SEL can have an impact here is important. This comes, though, again, with a warning, because SEL should not be viewed as a solution to mental illness. So let's look at some other practical benefits. In some, the current data collected from many studies indicate that adding an SEL program in the school curriculum can lead to several real-life benefits for students. Even gains of 22% in terms of fewer conduct problems is a worthwhile benefit because it reflects that an SEL program can add to school services compared to what each school is currently doing. And then let's look at young adults. There's additional benefits as they are related to young adults found in this 2011 meta-analysis. Kindergartners who experienced an SEL environment were more likely to graduate from high school, complete a college degree, and obtain stable employment in young adulthood, all the way back to kindergarten where they received these components. And they are less likely to depend on public assistance, live in public housing, be involved with the police, and end up in a detention facility. So in short, SEL has been shown to boost academics, improve mental wellness, provide return on investment. If people are concerned about economy and the economic impact, SEL has on average for every $1 invested has an $11 return of benefits. And then they support lifelong outcomes. But let's not forget about adults, right? SEL can also dramatically impact the well-being of adults. This data indicates that teachers who possess SEL competencies are more likely to remain in the classroom longer, are able to protect themselves from burnout, are able to develop and manage nurturing relationships with their students, serve as a behavioral role model, regulate their own emotions, and overall greater level of job satisfaction. Who wouldn't want that, right? So now I am going to pass it back to Sarah, and we're going to dig in really deep into SEL framework.
Thank you, Kerry. I am going to introduce you to Castle's SEL framework, and a few things that I'd like to share with you before we dive in here is two primary things. SEL is not meant to be an additional add-on, something else that you have to do. We hear you. We know how overwhelmed teachers are right now. SEL is actually meant to align, support, and be integrated into your existing work. And I'm going to give a shout out here to all the early childhood educators in the world. We've been doing SEL all the way through. What those early childhood skills, when we're saying to a child, hey, how do you think you made him feel? We're just trying to extend all that good work that you do in those early grades. So pats on the back to the early childhood educators here. The other thing that I want to point out is this is not a framework that is an all or nothing proposition. You don't have to do absolutely everything at once. You don't have to bite off the SEL and make it your mantra and your focus for the coming year. It's something that you can start gradually building on. You're already doing a lot of these great things. And it will be easy for you to look at the assets that you have and build on those over time. So you can start simple and build big. It's also something that's very familiar to you, okay? We all know that it's better to get a team together to start down a path on something new. So if you're starting down the path of SEL, you want to build on your existing teams. You definitely want to put a team together that's multidisciplinary, but I'm here to say you don't need a new team. You probably have a team that would gladly take on this charge or would make sense to be the right team. So don't think that we're adding to your load here. We're trying to actually lighten your load by introducing SEL into your educational world. So CASEL is the Collaborative for Academic and Social Emotional Learning. And what I want to point out about them is that they've been around a really long time, and they did this work by gathering stakeholders in the field. This is a framework that's been built by teachers in the field that do it every day. This isn't a bunch of researchers that came up with best practices. This is a group that has built this framework on the backs of the teachers that do it. And it starts out by it's based on the 5 competencies. Next slide. The Castle 5 are broad and interrelated areas of competence. They're self-awareness, self-management, self-management, social awareness, relationship skills, and responsible decision-making. I don't know why. I couldn't see that part. Next slide. The 5 competencies, here they are again in a different format, but you can go on. We're going to dive into them each one at a time. And I am going to go a little fast. I want to make sure that you know we're not here to give you everything you need to know to implement social emotional learning. This is a broad overview, and we're going to give you tons of resources to get started on how to do this well. The first competency is self-awareness. And self-awareness helps us to understand the cultural assets and recognize our own prejudices and biases. We know that we all have biases. And we know that identifying them will only lead to continuous improvement, not only of ourselves, but of our community. So if you look here, I'm not going to read through every slide because these are very dense, but you can see high-level pieces of self-awareness are identifying your personal, cultural, and linguistic assets. I imagine that's really important in your communities abroad. Identifying your own emotions and being aware of your emotions, demonstrating honesty and integrity, having a growth mindset, and developing interest and a sense of purpose. The next competency is self-management. So now that we know what our feelings are and what our biases are and what our values are, managing our own emotions is sometimes hard for kids, but it's also sometimes hard for adults, right? So this includes recognizing your emotions and being able to regulate yourself and maybe regulate others as well. So this helps us also set our personal and collective goals and take action to make change in our community. So we're going to identify ways that we regulate ourselves by self-management of stress. We're going to be able to set our own goals and recognize where we want to be and how we want to get there. Show courage to take initiative and help others to set collective goals. That's really important in a school environment, right? The next competency is social awareness. And this is where we understand diverse social norms, including unjust ones, really pertinent in our current political climate. Also understand the systemic influences on our behaviors. So recognizing what other people feel, recognizing their perspectives, and maybe recognizing what events bring them to have the feelings and thoughts and perspectives that they do. There's a lot of work being done out there that when we see a person who seems dysregulated, we should look at them and say, gosh, what happened to you? Not what's wrong with you. Because we all reach a point where we struggle to understand other people and their perspectives. And we have to recognize that. We also have to show concern and understanding for other people and express gratitude for their views, recognize the situational demands and opportunities that diverse perspectives can bring. So the next slide. We've all been talking about relationships. We all know relationships are the secret sauce. They're the thing that we know teachers, administrators, students, families, and communities recognize very much the role relationships have right now. And what we know is that COVID-19 has had a real impact on our ability to build strong relationships. This is kind of the hard part and the thing that we're all working on. So relationship skills are meant to include cultural competencies and how we stand up for the rights of others. When we think about bullying prevention programs, we think of upstanders, bystanders. This is where we start to build relationships with other people and understand how we not only influence one another, but how we need to have some collective support for one another, especially in these times of great disconnection, right? So resolving conflicts constructively, resisting negative social pressures like social media pressure, showing leadership, and seeking and offering support. Sometimes it's really important to just say, I don't know how you feel, but I see that you're upset, and name it and understand it. It'll improve your relationship if you just call it out and say, I understand that you're feeling that way. Next slide. So responsible decision-making, we all know that we have to make data-driven decisions, but this is kind of different because our ability to make caring and constructive choices about personal behavior and social interactions across diverse situations is really something that we're getting intentional about in classrooms and in schools. So this is how we work towards solutions together to solve personal and social problems, and how we support the collective well-being of the whole group. And so this is where we start to think collaboratively about how we work with one another when looking at a social problem, or even just a school problem, even if it's just something that's going on in our school, like our water supply is compromised. How do we come together to solve these problems? And responsible decision-making is a part of everything that we do. I'm calling out that this is all not new to you guys. You're doing this already. We're just trying to put it in a framework for you. Next slide. So the key settings are the next part of the CASTLE framework. And what the key settings do are recognize that these competencies were not created in a vacuum, and they are shaped by the interactions, relationships, and environments that we work and live in every day. CASTLE's framework really emphasizes the role of settings across learning environments and how we engage with authentic school, family, and community partnerships to coordinate our SEL practices across those environments. The 5 competencies are the focus of the SEL framework, and we want to make sure that people are using the whole framework in elevating the importance of these settings. The blue rings on the top are the settings. So the first setting is the classroom, the one we know well. And there's many different ways to engage in classroom SEL, right? Everything from teaching practices and approaches to targeted curriculum that can be utilized. There's great curriculums out there and they're free, and some of them come at a cost, but many of them are based on practices that you're already doing, like project-based learning and cooperative learning. And the integration of SEL standards across curriculum is done all across in many states, in many frameworks. You can look up SEL integrated into core curriculum and you'll get tons of great resources. But many of the areas that you focus on are absolutely required to focus on are ripe settings to implement SEL. Math and language arts and science and health and PE are all areas where SEL is just ripe and able to be implemented without adding something additional on. Classroom-based approaches include explicit instruction through social and emotional skills and attitudes that are taught. Again, those early childhood people, we've been doing this all along. We just needed to tell all the people over 8 all about it. Teaching practices that are cooperative learning and project-based learning. We've all recognized in recent years the value of team learning. I know my own teenagers are still telling me all the time about the team member that didn't hold their weight and how they're going to approach that person and how they're going to make sure that they start to do their work. And that's an SEL competency, right? How we work as a team. Integration of SEL in academic curriculum. Again, it's very easy to do even in some of our specials like PE and drama and art. It's all right for SEL implementation in the classroom. In schools, effectively integrating school-wide SEL happens in many different ways, in different places. It's rooted in a sense of belonging that leads to increased engagement, not only by the students, but by the families and staff in the school. SEL enhances existing systems and student support by integrating goals and practices with universal, targeted, and intensive academic and behavioral supports. Student voice is one way that schools can really improve their school-wide SEL. I come from the health world, and I can tell you that for the last 20 years, we've been talking about engaging youth as voices at the decision-making table. And student voice is recently being recognized as imperative to successful programming across everything that we do. And SEL is no different. You need to engage students at every level. Your kindergartners have a voice and they should be heard. And this is a way that they can be heard. In school-wide SEL, we really want to elevate student voice, student choice, student decision-making, and family and staff as well. Families and caregivers, as I mentioned, are part of a strong school culture. Like everything else in a school, SEL is more successful when families work in partnership with schools in establishing the goals, the norms, and the values to reflect their own experiences. Family voice, it's kind of just like student voice, including those champion parents, the parents that want to be there every day, that want to contribute. Tap them, put them to work. And maybe sometimes it'll actually alleviate your burden because they won't be knocking on your door so much because you've given them a good job to do. But including family voice, especially for marginalized groups, is detrimental to the planning, implementing, and improving of SEL. Communities. Partnerships extend the effectiveness of SEL to beyond the school day and to the after school and home environment. Some partners that include physical and mental health providers. Mental health systems in your community are key partners in implementing SEL. I know that many of you probably are familiar with behavioral health framework. It's very similar to this one in that there's different levels and tiers of support. Involving your community partners in that is really, really a way to reduce your burden and really make more effective programming. So I'm thinking a lot about some schools I worked with in the past where they established really strong connections to community providers. And sometimes they did that with their parent champions. So we all know that during COVID, we've been tapping all the doctor parents in classes. We've all been reaching out to those doctors and saying, come in and help us. We need you. SEL is just like that. We can engage all the community partners parents that are interested in improving your school community. Here's your spot to bring them in. Out of school time providers, wherever your students go after school should be involved in helping you with defining your SEL program and supporting it beyond your school day. So a lot of kids go to after school daycares or after school sports. Involve your coaches in your SEL training and programming. They're here to help. Community-based nonprofits can be helpful, and other local businesses. There's a ton of local businesses out there that might just provide dinner when you're doing your SEL training. Tap them, use them. It'll only improve your ability to implement SEL in your classrooms and in your schools. The indicators of school-wide SEL. This is something that I've had to use this slide probably more than any other, and I'll tell you why. I'm a big believer in understanding what the indicators of a successful program are from the inception, because we all know we're going to have to evaluate everything we do. If we understand ahead of time what the indicators are for successful implementation, we'll be able to build an evaluation that proves to be fruitful for us. So the 10 indicators are meant to provide evidence of the effectiveness of your SEL programs and practices. We must always engage in continuous improvement. That's not news to teachers in schools. We've been doing that all along, every subject area, everything we do. But in order to engage in continuous improvement, the indicators should not be viewed as a checklist, okay? Because then you're going to have fragmented approaches and fragmented success. We want to make sure that this is kind of a continuous list, and I will point out it is not in order. You can pick, for instance, youth voice and engagement and say, okay, I'm going to move the needle on that. In these first couple of months, I'm going to establish a youth advisory council. I'm going to engage youth voice in many different areas of my school planning. But then you really can't just focus on that one thing and expect to have successful SEL implementation. You have to really take a look at the whole list. And that way you'll have a more comprehensive and more robust, successful SEL program. So the next piece, resources for effective implementation. I want to call out that in order to effectively implement SEL, we would have to have many more days together, many more hours together. We are not going to be able to sufficiently tell you right here, right now, everything you need to know, but we are going to provide you with resources so you'll know where to go. But right now, I'm going to touch on the high level pieces that are super important for successful implementation of SEL. Castle has developed a theory of action for effective implementation, and it's built on many, many years of field testing SEL programs in schools. And it's based on school level implementation, district level implementation, statewide implementation, and national implementation. And therefore, we have all sorts of different data that has contributed to this theory of action. It reflects years of testing and involves 4 focus areas. I'm going to go ahead and play this. Well, first I'm going to touch on the 4 focus areas, and then we'll play this video. The theory of action grew out of the importance of understanding how to implement SEL. And what we've learned are that there are 4 key conditions that have to exist in order to effectively implement social emotional learning. The first one is foundational support by building a collective vision, collective goals, and a collective plan for SEL. Again, this isn't news to any teacher who in the field. We've all had to build collective vision, goals, and plans for math and English and everything else. SEL is no different. We need to have a team that is really looking at this and checking in on our effective implementation and moving the needle on what to do next. And so a foundational support would look like a very diverse group of stakeholders that are a part of your SEL team. That's going to include administration, teachers, families, students, community providers, your building and grounds person, your support staff that could include folks that work in school lunchroom, folks that work on the school busing and transportation team. We know that a diverse group of stakeholders are foundational for the success of SEL. And so that's the first focus area, is get a broad group of diverse stakeholders involved. The second focus area is built to strengthen adult SEL in your school. Remember how I said early childhood educators have been doing SEL all along? We never did understand why it dropped off the radar. We were all like, people, this still goes on, because we had to do it all along with parents, because the parents of young children, they're in uncharted territory. They're scared, they're anxious. And so adult SEL is something that early childhood folks have done all along. And now we recognize the need to continue doing that long into adulthood. Strong SEL programs start in the very early years and never stop. It goes all the way through the lifespan. So that's a really great, groundbreaking discovery that we've had in education lately is that SEL is a continuum that never ever stops. You're never done. You do this by cultivating a trusting community that enhances personal professional competencies in adults to broaden their capacity to support student SEL. It's kind of the old adage I know Chris has used many times. We have to put on our own life mask before we can help the student that is not breathing well. This is the same. We kind of have to check in with our own biases. We have to check in with our own feelings and emotions before we're able to help other students or families or staff deal with theirs. So strengthening adult SEL is as important as doing it with our students and young people. The third focus area to promote SEL for students is developing a coordinated and intentional approach in your classroom, in your school, in your home and community. And this will ensure consistent, culturally responsive and developmentally appropriate opportunities for students to enhance their SEL competencies. We have to build out a plan and we have to check in with the plan all the way through. It'll go back to the slides previously on the 10 indicators. We have to put together our team and find our first goal and start to work on that. And then we have to do continuous improvement and say, where are we there? And when are we ready to add the next goal? And when are we ready to look at the next indicator of successful SEL? There's definitely great resources in CASEL that will help walk you through how to do this really well. Again, we can't dive too deep into it right now because it would take hours and days. And by the way, I'd love to do that. That's my fun stuff. But I think for right now, we just have to recognize the need for a coordinated systemic approach across all those 4 environments. And the last focus area is that we have to continuously reflect on data that drives that continuous improvement and establish a process to collect that data and inform our planning. Now, those indicators are really good. I call it a cheat sheet on what kind of data we want to start collecting from the very beginning, because we know those are the indicators we're wanting to move on. So that's kind of like my way of guiding you to some good, a good start on developing data sources that you want to collect. But I'm not going to dwell too much on collecting data because I don't know. I kind of suspect you people have had to do that already. I'm pretty confident you understand the need to collect data, and I'm pretty sure you've done a lot of it. So this is no different than your English literacy, math data. We still have to collect data and continuously improve our programs. Next slide. I'm going to let this video play here on you'll need how to create a strong action plan to begin implementation of SEL.
With social and emotional learning, you can create schools where every student feels connected, inspired, and ready to contribute to the world around them. CASEL shares guidance on a process to implement SEL in your community. Let's dive deeper into the continuous improvement cycle that drives SEL implementation. To reach your vision, you'll need to track your progress and assess your impact. This begins with setting strong SEL goals that can be measured. There are 2 types of goals. Outcome goals are related to identifiable changes in experience, knowledge, or skills. Implementation goals are about the steps you take to get to your outcome. You'll need both kinds of goals as a foundation for a strong action plan. A helpful way to create strong goals is to use the acronym SMARTY. SMARTY stands for specific, measurable, attainable, relevant, time-bound, inclusive, and equitable. Let's revisit your outcome goal and make it stronger. What grade levels are you focused on? How will you measure belonging? Based on past trends, what's a target that's motivating but still attainable? If this goal is met, is it a stepping stone toward the vision? When do you hope to meet this goal? How can working this goal include all key voices, particularly those that tend to be left out? Finally, how is your goal driving equitable outcomes? It's important to look at data in a way that reveals disparities that need to be addressed. When your SEL goals are clear, you're ready to develop an action plan. For more support, visit Castle's Guides for Schools and Districts.
I know that, again, this isn't new to you guys, but every good plan to implement anything is based on the ability to pull together good people that start to look at your assets and build on them and establish goals that are SMARTY goals. I always have had to do SMART goals, and it was only when I started to interact with Castle that the SMARTY candy became even more important to have at a meeting. So SMARTIes are great goals to have. I love the last two, inclusive and equitable. Heaven knows that's a focus on everything we do lately. So next slide. I want to make sure that you guys know that Castle is the gold standard, the place to go for more information on this. We're certainly here to help guide you. I love answering questions and pointing to good resources, but they really have been the go-to resource for everything SEL. What's really wonderful is the programs that they have there are all research-based and evidence-based. So you know that they're going to have been proven to be effective. And so it kind of helps you to not start down a path. I know in one school in the beginning of SEL, I had a school that said, oh, we have a parent who does something, and I think that's going to be really useful. And I was like, well, I'm not sure that's A, what we need, B, different from what we do already. And we don't want to kind of go down the path of trying something out without having clear vision of where we want to go with it. And Castle's really good at helping you to build systemic, resource-based SEL programs that can dive really deep in and have curriculum for you, but also have really high-level practices and policies in place to support your SEL implementation. With that, I'm going to turn it back over to Chris, I believe, and he's going to close us out and we'll answer questions.
That sounds excellent. And as we get ready to sort of transition here, what I want to do is I want to take a second to sort of craft an action plan, because for me, the most exciting part of a conversation like this is actually not the conversation that we've just had and we'll keep going, but it's the action that you take coming out of it. And so I want to start by naming that most of us, and if I could just get a show of thumbs for folks that are off video, or hands for folks that are on video, how many of us built a COVID response team at the beginning of the pandemic? A team that was tasked with figuring out how we would go virtual should we need to. Remember those days? A team that then executed the virtual transition. A team that then sort of anticipated the changes that might roll out, and a team that perhaps even is still analyzing on a regular basis whether or when we will return to campus. So I'll just look for a show of thumbs if you have that team in place or built that team. You can also send a DM to me on the Zoom chat, or you can give me a thumbs up on the camera. It's actually looking like not nearly as many folks have done that, and or it's possible that we may not actually have access to the thumbs. I'm realizing rats. So that's why I'm not seeing any thumbs. But my guess is that many of us have created a team like that is probably a combination of staff and faculty, maybe a parent, as Sarah mentioned, maybe a physician or 2 or 10, maybe members of other school boards, and maybe others, depending on our community. And one of the easiest opportunities I would suggest that we can take advantage of is to actually take that team and repurpose it to the re-entry of students to campus for those that haven't gotten there yet, and or those who are approaching that moment in time right now. And include for that team this SEL dialogue and some of the benchmarks that Sarah talked about earlier and Kerry talked about earlier that help us measure our success from a relationship, a connection, and belonging perspective. And if we start to task that team, instead of saying we need you to focus on academics and education and digital transition and all of those elements, caring for students while they're remote, all of those, by the way, were incredibly important, they were invaluable in the moment that we initially assigned them. But now we're starting to reach this point where we can pivot that group yet again and ask them to focus on the re-entry of students and the reestablishment, if I can use that word, of belonging for students on our campuses. So I would suggest that that's the first action, is to assign that team to pivot, essentially, to focusing on reestablishing connection and belonging on campus, as we've hopefully laid out for you today. The second item I would suggest is actually establishing now a single point of contact to take and own this team and own the responsibility of establishing or reestablishing connection and belonging on campus. And as Sarah said, this is not something that can happen in a vacuum. This is not something that we want to have happen in a vacuum. But what we've also found in schools is that the best way to make progress is to assign a single person whose sole responsibility it is, or maybe who has many other responsibilities, but at least has one assigned responsibility of ensuring that they are focused on one area. And so in safety and security, it may be a director of safety and security. In health, as we've dealt with through the pandemic, it may be a nurse or a healthcare provider. And in social emotional learning, it may be any number of folks on our campuses. But I would suggest that the most effective way to make progress here is to assign an owner and then to reestablish that team, or to pivot that team if it already exists. From here, what I want to do is I'm going to start running through questions, and I'm going to ask these questions of Kerry and Sarah. I will probably chime in with some as well. But I'll also name that if you would like to at any point jump in and voice over a question that you have, I welcome you to just raise your hand in the Zoom chat, and we will come to you and unmute you and invite you to share out your question. But I will get started and go sort of in order. Which I believe we're going to start with Cheryl. So Cheryl's first question was, how have other international schools worked to support the transition through distance learning to hybrid learning, and now for those that are lucky enough to have students fully back on campus after such a long time at home? So Sarah and Kerry, can you speak to sort of this transition, what you've seen, let's speak to both domestic and international schools here. What have we seen that's worked, and maybe what have we seen that's failed?
Sure. In my interactions with schools, I've learned a couple of things on this reentry piece. Number one, we need to ditch the words new normal. There's no normal left. We're past that. And what we want to do is first focus on the sense of belonging. First focus on building the connection that we've lost. So I've heard a lot about schools that are literally having morning meeting that they used to have once a week for half an hour. Morning meeting is an hour a day now. And it's built up to do more connection with students, more celebration, more sharing of problems and sharing of concerns, sharing of anxious feelings. And so I've heard from a lot of schools that extending that morning meeting time has been a key piece of bringing kids back. The other thing is, in the health coordinators that I've worked with, we've done a lot of shifting of thinking of, wow, let's think a lot about what's happened in the last year and a half and keep it kind of at the forefront of our minds when dealing with a dysregulated kid. Because I think someone shared in the chat, be prepared for energy. Wow, boy, I know even my own 14-year-old was so excited to get to school that she's not a high energy kid anyway, but she was very enthusiastic. And so when she first got there, she was on a high. She was I love high school. This is amazing. I love it. And then very soon afterwards, there was a big drop in her enthusiasm and her comfort level in going to school. So I think we have to be prepared for the ups and downs of coming back. And I think all your gut feeling on building connectedness and belonging is really going to help you. It's just establishing more opportunities to actually connect with each other. We need to have, maybe I heard of one school that instituted a third recess. They had the health coordinator said he suggested a third recess, and every teacher raised their hand and said, oh yeah, we want a third recess. And for 25 years, they had never considered this. It was a very simple 10-minute recess, but they redid their schedules to include that, and it had a positive outcome. So I think being mindful of this feeling of disconnect and making sure we're providing tons of opportunities for connection and belonging. I will tell you that on Joffe Academy, we do have an amazing training on building connectedness and belonging, and there's some really intentional pieces to that. If you need access to that, we can share with you ways that you can get to that training. Kerry, do you have any suggestions?
Yeah, so mine kind of build off of what you had said, Sarah. First and foremost, there's going to be a time and a place for learning. Day one is probably not that time, and school is not the place on day one. Again, you have students, and I saw in the chat some that have been out for 2 years. They have to relearn what it means to be back in this structured setting. They probably haven't had regular meal times, lunch and the schedule. So first and foremost, you just have to understand that there's going to be this period of time, and Sarah talked about like this connectedness, just having fun, doing activities, bringing kids back to like kind of a central focus, and then start to integrate some of the learning in small doses. And simultaneously, I think it's really important that you revisit discipline policies and procedures. Again, you're going to be seeing a lot of behaviors that you're like, what, you know, you can't do this at home. Why are you doing it here? Well, they forgot, right? And so just thinking about what are the disciplinary policies in your school, and is there a team set up to discuss those before consequences are kind of dealt out? So those are just the two pieces that I would speak to.
And I'll add a couple of thoughts, just again, sort of building on Sarah and Kerry's comments here, which actually are informed by Amy Cuddy, who's a organizational psychologist and has done a lot of work in and around sort of our collective psychology as it relates to COVID-19, the response to the pandemic in the early days, and then the ongoing sort of fatigue and exhaustion that's associated with the pandemic itself. And one of the things that Amy talks about, Dr. Cuddy talks about, that resonates deeply with me is that at the very beginning of the pandemic, we had this surge to action. And I think a lot of us remember those early days where it felt like things were changing by the moment. I remember we at the time were doing every Monday we were doing a webinar, and we would write the webinar deck on Sunday night. And by Monday morning, which, we're talking less than 12 hours, things had changed so much that we had to rewrite the webinar deck. And then by the time we started the webinar, we had it what we thought was pretty current. And by the end, there were many times in those early days where the content was wrong already. And I say that to say that many of us remember those moments and all that went along with those moments. But one thing that we had going for us in those moments was a call to arms that we shared together. We were all focused on getting to a position of safety for ourselves, for our loved ones, and for our communities as a whole. And so it didn't matter what we had to do to get there. We were focused on it, and we were going to climb that mountain. We were going to run the marathon, whatever metaphor you want to use. Well, over time, we lost that sort of momentum and energy and adrenaline that fueled us in the early days, because that's what happens, right? And we moved into a place where our energy collectively dropped. And that was the point where we reached some of our first burnout days and first burnout moments, where we started to question the sustainability of our activities. That same thing begins as we return to school. In the first few days, right, the moments that Sarah was talking about where her daughter was incredibly excited and the enthusiasm was there and the momentum was there and she couldn't wait to get to school day in and day out, that's adrenaline fueled because she had missed school and missed the opportunity to be connected and to belong within that community. Sarah, I'm not talking necessarily specifically about your daughter here, but in general, we saw that across our students. And then again, as so many of you have pointed out in the chat, we get to this point a couple of weeks in where that momentum no longer carries itself. And so how do we fix that? One suggestion is to create an artificial call to arms, to create a purpose and a project and a joint effort that the school begins to work on. And I think depending on your role in the school, your mind might have immediately gone to fundraising. Not sure that's the one, but there may be something else, whether it's a community project. Building a bench was one that we heard one school work on together, where, and I know that sounds simple, but it was a bench of like little tiny Legos, and the bench was the size of an elephant. And so it took weeks for the community to work on it. Of course, as they got closer and closer to completion, the adrenaline sort of picked back up. The students got excited about it, teachers got excited about it, and then they celebrated the completion of the bench. I realize that may sound like an insane prospect, and so I don't necessarily want to suggest that everybody on this call should go out and build a Lego bench. But I hope the point is there, that there's an opportunity to align the community toward a specific goal. And if you had to pick, what I would suggest is that we assign that goal about 2 or 3 weeks in, because that'll be about the time we start to lose that high energy, and then have that goal span us for another 3 to 6 weeks, and have it be a project or a focus point for 3 to 6 weeks, kind of sustaining that energy, sustaining toward a common purpose, getting us united again. The flip side is we may see some of that call to arms as a result of the conflict that exists in Ukraine and Russia right now, where again this plays out in different communities different ways. There may be a sense of divide and disconnection that happens as a result in some communities and or in subsets of each of our communities. There may also be a desire to sort of coalesce and to help and to support and to invest in some way, invest human time, capital, whatever it might be. And so again, that may be an opportunity, and each school has to analyze whether that's appropriate for your community or how to do that in an appropriate way for your community. But my push is that there's an opportunity to create a goal that everybody can work on together. I want to go to the next question that I had seen here, and this was more tactical. It was sort of, as students return, what are some of the first now I've lost it. So I'm going to have to come back to that question. And holy cow, there's so many here. I'm seeing a few things that I want to just reiterate. Kerry mentioned this, but Angie shared, there's this sort of fear of what have students not learned over the last few years. And Angie mentioned, let's not rush into catching up with the academics. I think that's real. And for a lot of our schools, it's so palpable, the pressure that they're feeling to both return to social emotional learning or some sense of connection and belonging, and return to high achievement and incredible academic results and things like that. And what I'll share is, and something we've been talking about more and more over the last maybe 3 to 6 months, is that in order for students to succeed, we know this, we have the data to demonstrate this, they have to feel safe. And especially our youngest students who have lived now several years, in some cases the majority of their lives, but in others a significant portion of their lives, feeling afraid. That means that we've got to first work on ensuring that they feel safe before we can work on ensuring that they can learn. Seeing from Angie and from Anka, sort of this theme of like just exhaustion. How do you support students? And so Kerry, Sarah, I want to turn that to you as like, all right, we tried the unity thing, we tried the goal, we tried the connection, we tried fist bumps on the way out in the morning, we tried those things. What else can we do? How else can we restore energy and enthusiasm within our community? Or is that the right goal? Is there perhaps maybe a different focus that we should start to look at?
I'll start with this one and then maybe Sarah. Okay. I think that exhaustion, and there were a couple other comments that talked about this too. It's not just the students, it's the parents and it's the teachers, it's you guys. And so I think that as a whole, we have to understand and address exhaustion as a whole. So I think first and foremost, I did another webinar where it said, stop talking about self-care. Self-care is not helpful. Instead, we need to turn to one another and help others. So we feel invigorated, we feel more power and more satisfaction when we can help others. So take time, ask your neighbor teacher how they're doing. Maybe bring them a cup of coffee. Maybe, have time that you can connect with them. Take time to talk to parents. Understand what frame they're coming from for the last 2 years. We've been at home with our kids, and God love us, we love our children, but trying to educate our children while being parents is a skill that I have not mastered. And so parents need some patience and understanding, and teachers need a perception of what was life like each day at home. And then, all of this trickles down to the kids. So I know I saw there was short schedules, so limited time for connections. It takes 5 seconds to look a kid straight in the eye and say, I see you. I see that you're not very happy today. Tell me what's going on. Or the fist bumps in the hallway, right? So it doesn't take long to just make that connection, but we have to stop and acknowledge and ask others how they're doing and not assume.
The only thing I will add to that, and this is something that I heard from some of our staff, is that we have to really be intentional about being fun and bringing joy, because the way that we connect the best is when we're sharing in some wonderful, happy activity. Now, I understand that sometimes that's hard based on the restrictions. If you can't eat a meal together, right? That's one way that we all like to share and socialize. So finding other ways to be joyful and have fun, even in those short sprints. I'll share with you, when we first were on COVID restrictions in my house, we decided that we would take on, for dinner one night, we would take on the persona of someone else in our family. Now, it sounds a little nuts, but it was probably the most laughter I've ever had with my children and my family. It didn't last long. It was very short, but we just pretended to be one another. And it was very lighthearted and fun. I think you have to be really good at gauging where folks are, but there's a lot of ways that you can engage in something very quick that's fun and brings joy, that will really help to establish that connectedness and regulate your students. That's just my own. I've heard where folks are, for the first time as teachers, getting intentional about having a joyful minute, having a happy minute, or having a special time at the end of the day. The other thing that I would say is, if you haven't done this already, bring back reading together. We all know the data so clearly that if we all read, one person reads out loud, maybe it's the teacher, maybe it's students reading to one another, but if we all take turns reading a collective story together, we know that that has always promoted connectedness and belonging in a classroom. I can tell you right now, all of my kids remember the books that were read in their classroom more than the books. I read these kids all the Harry Potter books, and I mean, they remember that, but I don't get credit like Miss Natalie did, who read one story in the 5th grade. So I would encourage you all, if you aren't doing it already, to read together.
As I'm scrolling through questions here, another theme I'm seeing is just this, this disconnect between the physical connection and the opportunity for, right, like eating lunch or shorter days, and that the desire to have lunch together, community time together, recess together, but we're still in cohorts, or we're still sort of stuck with the restrictions that exist. And I just, as I was reading through one of these, I found myself thinking about Linda Clyatt-Wayman, who's a principal at a tough school in, I don't remember where actually, but it was full of conflict and fights
Philly.
challenges day in and day out. Philly, that's right.
Philly.
But she's incredible principal and incredible human. But one of the mantras that she developed, that she used to endure the first few weeks and months at that school, and then to really cause a turnaround for that school, was if nobody told you they love you today, remember that I do, and I always will. And I think the message there of encouraging or insisting on relationships first, and getting back to that place. And if it's teacher to teacher, if it's admin to teacher, if it's teacher to student, if it's student to student, but just reminding people in every opportunity that the purpose of being back on campus, the opportunity given to us from being back on campus, is so that we can connect, even more so than so that we can learn. That we've spent 2 years, for so many of us, I'm reading in the Philippines where we're still closed. We've spent 2 years, we've learned that we can learn digitally. What we've learned though too is that we can't connect nearly as well. And so I want to push that again. And I realize I'm pushing that same concept over and over again in different ways, but do want to keep pushing it. I'm seeing another question come up that I want to speak to, which is, how do you convince parents that it's okay to start to come back to school? And I'll share that this has been a huge focus for us, because we believe that attendance is now tied to parent confidence in school safety. And of course, this is most impactful in the days after you've been cleared to reopen, and so you've started to have students come back to campus. And then it spans from there forward. And we saw it through the surges that we saw worldwide. We saw it through the early days as some countries began to resume in-person education. But fundamentally, what we're trying to influence, the only thing we can influence, is parent confidence. We're doing the safety stuff, right? Our protocols exist, our departments of public health or whatever version of that exists within our community have more or less created the standards for us. And if we didn't have a government or scientific, I'm going to call it community, but organization, I guess is maybe a better word, insisting on what we needed to do from a safety perspective, then we built our own, right? So we followed the protocols. We're all there. And fundamentally, we're doing what we need to be doing to keep students as safe as we possibly can. So therefore, the only thing we can influence, the only part of the equation that we can influence, is how parents feel about our ability to meet the standards that have been set for us, or that we have set for ourselves. And the best way we found to do that is to build a regular cadence of communication. This is especially important for our international schools, where parents are not on campus and don't have the benefit of seeing the practices in place day to day. It's also important for those of us whose campuses may have reopened to students, but not reopened to parents or visitors or guests. And what I'll share is that in our most successful schools, we're seeing a weekly communication. And it's every single Monday at noon, or every single Friday at 5, or whatever it might be. But that message goes out and it says, here are 3 things that we did on campus that were joyous and wonderful and fun this week. Here are 3 strategies that we use to keep our students safe. And here are 3 things that we're anticipating for next week. So it's short and it's simple, and parents are done reading, frankly. I love Sarah's point about reading books, so I want to clarify, not necessarily that, but they're done reading our long emails, right? They're done reading all of that. But what will resonate with them is a picture of joy on campus, a picture of students reconnecting and learning, maybe a picture of students reading in a classroom even. And then a couple of bullet points around what specifically we're doing on campus. And so I want to encourage folks to get back to those regular communications that so many of us started with at the beginning of the response, because what we've found is that keeping to those right now is one of the best ways to influence parent confidence, which in turn influences student attendance. Sarah, Kerry, anything to add for sort of helping to, I'm going to just use that word again, convince parents that it's safe to send their kids to school? Oh, and Sarah, you are on mute.
I was hoping to get through this whole thing without being told I'm on mute. I was so close. So the only thing I would say is that recognizing the anxiousness of parents and naming it and saying, I understand that you don't feel safe. I know for my own self, here I was somebody who was promoting it and saying, oh yes, we can bring kids back safely. But when I was actually doing it, it was a really hard moment for me because I was like, what if something happens? What if she gets sick? So I think, just what you said, Chris, about recognizing how anxious parents are and naming it and allowing them to feel the way they feel, but then reassuring them that we've done X, Y, and Z in that short bulleted point that you're saying, Chris. Here are some of the things we've done to make sure it is safe for you to bring your kid back. And I agree with you, not a long digest version, but just something short and sweet. And maybe it's a daily communication. Here's something else we did, but making it short is key to making sure folks are reading it for sure. Kerry, you have anything?
I'm afraid that what I'm going to say is going to be controversial. So I fear that maybe I should not say it.
I say throw it out there.
I mean, the reality is we have to get to the point that we weigh moving forward in life with the risk. And I think that all the data, all the science, all of the mitigation strategies that we've put into play are to reduce risk. But life, every aspect of life, you weigh risks, right? And so parents making the decision to send their child back to school, that yes, there's a risk, but does the positive impact of the child going outweigh potential risk of COVID? And have we as a family done everything we can to mitigate catching it, right? And so everything is you assess risk.
Yeah, I love that. And I'll say, I mean, I don't think it's controversial. I don't think it's controversial to reassign the opportunity to make that decision, right? To weigh those risks and make that decision to the family. And fundamentally, what we're trying to do at the school level is to ensure that we have taken all reasonable steps to mitigate risk, to reduce the risk of transmission of COVID on campus. We talked at the beginning, we were with y'all over a year ago, I think now, about what the steps were to mitigate the risk. And so we've done those things. And so part of our strategy is to communicate those things that we are still doing. In many cases, it's the same things. In some cases, it's a reduced set. And then to enable parents to make that choice and say, yes, I feel safe. I feel that risk is a risk worth taking. And so I so value that and think, really this is a conversation about giving parents the opportunity to make the best choice for their family and their child. I'll go to this. So we'll do two more questions, I think, for this morning, and then transition into sort of a wrap up, and then we'll talk about how to access us for more questions. I know there are many that we're seeing. I'm so grateful for that. This next question, I think I'm going to throw back to you, Kerry, is from Brandon, and this is a tough question, and we may not have an answer, which is, and if we don't, I'll challenge the group to help us come up with one. But as teachers, how do we bridge the gap when parental support is non-existent or is the root of the problem for the student? And I think what we're talking about here is maybe twofold. So one, if we have a boarding community where parents are not able to be engaged on a regular basis, I think two, we're talking where parents are themselves the root of the challenge.
Yeah, that's a really good question, Brandon. Disengaged parents prior to COVID does not magically create engaged parents afterwards, right? And so I don't think that anything any new strategy is coming after COVID. What did we do to try to improve parent engagement before the pandemic started? And again, I was having lots of conversations with schools about incentivizing parent engagement and interaction. How can we convince people and parents to be involved in their child's education? That's a difficult question to ask, but can we provide multiple opportunities for them to be included in the decision-making process? I think it goes back to, again, the SEL framework. Are parents being brought into questions and conversations about returning to school, lunchtime? Are there opportunities for them to voice their opinion and concerns and offer themselves up to becoming part of the school community? So again, I don't know that there's any new strategies following COVID. I think parent engagement has always been and will always be a difficult thing. But having somebody in the school whose role is parent and community engagement, they have a lot of tools in their own toolbox and how to solicit and get buy-in from parents. And so I would recommend somebody that really owns that role in schools to make a concentrated and concerted effort towards parent engagement.
I'm going to piggyback on that a little bit. In all my years in the classroom, I obviously was always thinking about how to engage parents. That, was a consistent theme for every year, different parents. One of the things that that I didn't think about was that some parents really don't believe they have something to offer by engaging with their kids. I know that sounds a little crazy, but I had a parent once say to me, "I don't know how to teach him. I'm not smart like you." That was a really humbling moment for me as a teacher, because I automatically assumed that parents were choosing not to be engaged. And maybe recognizing that some parents don't feel worthy. It might shift your lens a little bit about how you engage folks, because even more than ever now, parents are disconnected from us as well. Recognizing that it's not always what we assume. It's not always a choice they make, that they choose not to engage, that they're busy or distracted by something else. Many, many times they don't know how, and they don't always feel worthy. So I would challenge you to kind of talk to the parent and find out. And they may not always be open to sharing. It took a long time for me to recognize it with this parent, but it really was a humbling moment that shifted my gaze, that they didn't feel worthy of engaging. They felt like I was the smart teacher and that they didn't have a place in education. Maybe they never finished education themselves. Maybe they felt like they were not as smart even as their child. So I would just encourage you all to consider and try and dialogue if you can. I know it's not always easy, but it was, for me, a big learning experience to not assume parents are choosing not to be engaged.
Excellent. I know I said we would take 2 more questions, but I think that question was worthy of sort of unpacking and unraveling together. And so I hope you agree. We do want to be sensitive to the fact that we are at the approaching the end of our time together. And so I want to share a couple of closing thoughts and next steps for folks. The first and the most important one is I want to say thank you. The work that you all have done day in and day out since March of 2020 is nothing short of remarkable. And we have been simply watching from our computer screens your leadership and your investment and your exhaustion and so much more of the work that you've been doing. And so I want to just thank you for your willingness to continue to do that and for all that you've done up until this point as well. I want to remind you that, we always say you're not alone. We are focused on helping schools through any event that affects their ability to operate. So while I cannot wait to help support you through something beyond COVID, we're certainly here to support you through COVID and reentry in the short term as well. But of course, also look forward to supporting you in reevaluating safety and security strategy and health strategy and all of those other fun things that we will need to get back to at some point. We have a free webinar that continues every other Monday. We have a newsletter that goes out once a month, I believe now. And so I dropped the link in the chat for you and invite you to sign up to receive a copy of both of those. Both are totally free, so you don't have to worry about that stuff. And the last thing I'll say is we will send out a copy of this recording and the slide deck to you. I realize that we did not get to every question. I apologize for that, but do want to remind you that we have an email address, which is support@joffeeemergencyservices.com, and you are welcome to email any question that we didn't get to today to us, and we will reflect on it, we will respond to it, and we will dig in with you, potentially even on a one-on-one Zoom if that is appropriate for the question. So above all else, I want to thank you for your time this morning. Thank you for your leadership and your patience and your strength over the last 2 years. And I'll say, for many of us, we entered the pandemic in about 48 hours. We went from sort of a normal existence to the opposite of that. And we expect that the exit will take about 48 weeks. And so while I wish I could say that we were, toward the end, and I do believe that we were toward the end of the life-altering restrictions, I want to encourage folks to continue to work on this as though it were a marathon, because we do believe that we still have a ways left to go. So thank you. And with that, I'll turn it back to Ed.
Yes, just really quickly, thank you. This was really an informative event, and you can see from the comments in the chat, a lot of people were really happy, and I know they'd like to have even more. I think that the whole issue of what to do social emotional learning, you did a wonderful job of capturing the work of Castle and the sort of foundational work, and then also moving to dealing with the question of the moment is we're just reopening our school, and how do we do some of this stuff immediately and take care of the kids and one another? And this was a great way to help people start thinking. So I really appreciate your time, and you did a wonderful job, and we'll look forward to having you back for more. And all of you who gave up your morning, thank you so very much. And we hope that we see all of you at an Ear Coast conference, including people from Joffe Emergency Services, in the near future. And we're working on it. And please stay tuned for all of that. But for all that you're doing with the schools, all of you who are teaching and leading schools, I just think it's incredibly, it's just amazing the work you're doing and the resilience that you have and what you're providing for the young people and one another in the schools. Anything we can do, any additional sessions we can offer in support, please let me know. We're always looking for ideas and things that people want to hear more about. So with that, I'm going to turn off the recorder, and we'll look forward to the next time we can meet together. Thank you so very much.
Thank you.
Thank you.
Thank you.